This $2 box can do what some $40 garden products can't. It kills pests, protects plants, and solves problems most gardeners spend years fighting. And the craziest part? Millions of people already have it sitting in a cabinet and have no idea what it can do. Today, I'm revealing 11 hidden borax tricks, and the final one is so surprising that almost nobody talks about it. This video exists for one reason. Because almost nobody knows what this little white powder can actually do. But before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you gardening this year, and which pest is driving you crazy? Tomato hornworms, fire ants, slugs, Japanese beetles. I read every single one. I still remember being a little kid, standing on a wooden stool beside my grandmother in the kitchen. A line of ants had somehow invaded the pantry. She didn't buy a spray. She didn't call an exterminator. She took a small box from the cupboard, mixed a spoonful into a jar, and said, "By tomorrow, they'll be gone." I didn't believe her. The next morning, every ant had disappeared. That was my first lesson about borax. A simple mineral that's been sitting in American homes for more than a century, and according to university research, when used correctly, borax baits can spread through an entire ant colony and wipe it out from the inside. But ants are only the beginning. Because today I'm going to show you 11 borax tricks that most gardeners have never heard of. And the final one? It's the one that shocked me the most. Now here's the part that surprised me the first time I learned it. The old-timers knew this trick long before universities started studying it. And it begins with one of the most frustrating pests in any garden, ants. Not just one kind. Fire ants. Argentine ants. Pavement ants. I've watched this method work on nearly all of them. But here's the secret, borax doesn't kill the first ant that touches it. That's exactly why it works. The worker finds the sweet bait and thinks it has discovered treasure. It carries tiny pieces back to the nest. Then it feeds the queen. It feeds the larvae, and over the next few days, the entire colony begins collapsing from the inside. One ant becomes hundreds. Hundreds become none. That's why this simple little powder has been quietly defeating ant colonies for generations while most people keep buying expensive sprays that only kill the ants they can see. Here's exactly how my family made it. 1 teaspoon of borax. 1 cup of warm water. Half a cup of sugar. Stir until every grain disappears. Then soak a few cotton balls and place them right beside the ant trail. Now, this next part is important. Do not spray the ants. Do not wipe away the trail. And definitely do not kill the first few scouts. You need them alive. Because they're about to become your delivery service. They'll carry the sweet bait straight back to the nest, feed the queen, feed the larvae, and within days, the colony starts collapsing from the inside. I've watched long ant trails disappear completely after using this method. But ants are only the beginning. Because the next pest doesn't march into your kitchen. It sneaks into your garden after dark. You wake up to holes in your lettuce. Missing strawberry leaves. And those shiny slime trails across the soil. If you've ever grown hostas, lettuce, or strawberries, you already know the enemy. Slugs and snails. And what borax does next surprised even me. Slugs and snails may look harmless, until you walk into your garden one morning and find your lettuce shredded and your strawberries full of holes. Here's something most people don't realize. These pests lose moisture incredibly fast. That's why dry barriers can stop them in their tracks. Take a small amount of borax and sprinkle a thin ring around the base of the plant. Not on the leaves. Not against the stem. Just a narrow circle around the soil. After a heavy rain, refresh the ring. Most slugs simply won't cross it. I watched an old gardener protect an entire row of cabbage this way, using nothing more than a few cents worth of powder. No expensive pellets. No sprays. No traps. Just one simple barrier. But slugs are slow. The next pest is different. It moves fast. It attacks overnight. And by the time you notice the damage, it may already be too late. Number 3 surprised me the first time I heard it. Fleas. Not in the garden. In your carpet. Because every gardener knows the truth, the fleas usually come in from outside. One dog runs through the yard, and suddenly they're everywhere. Most people immediately reach for expensive sprays or call an exterminator. But old-timers had another trick. They sprinkled a light layer of borax across the carpet and gently worked it deep into the fibers with a soft broom. Then they left it alone. 24 hours. That's all. Because the real enemy isn't the flea you can see, it's the eggs and larvae hiding deep in the carpet where most sprays never reach. After a day, vacuum everything thoroughly. Many people repeated this once in early summer and again in early fall. One important warning: keep pets and small children out of the room while the borax is sitting in the carpet. The amazing part? You're not fighting the fleas you can see. You're stopping the next generation before it ever hatches. But fleas are tiny. The next problem is much bigger, and it can destroy an entire lawn from underground without you seeing a single thing. Number 4. Cockroaches. I don't even like saying the word. Every old house seems to get one eventually. And if you live in the South, you know they're not little. A friend of mine in Florida once told me, down here, roaches are basically mice with 6 legs. Now here's the interesting part. The trick isn't chasing them around with a spray. It's letting them do the work themselves. Mix equal parts borax and plain white flour. Some people use powdered sugar instead. Then dust a very thin line behind the refrigerator, under the stove, and along the back of the cupboards. Sooner or later, a roach walks through it. Then it does what roaches always do. It cleans itself. Every leg. Every antenna. And in the process, it swallows the powder. A day or two later, the problem begins solving itself. That's why old-timers like this method. The roach becomes its own worst enemy. But even cockroaches are easy to see. The next pest is different. It lives underground. You may never notice it, until huge patches of your lawn suddenly turn brown. Now this next one may be the most surprising use of borax in this entire video. Because this time, we're not killing anything. We're feeding the soil. Scientists have known for decades that boron is an essential micronutrient. And some of your favorite crops absolutely depend on it. Tomatoes. Broccoli. Cauliflower. Beets. Apples. Without enough boron, plants can look healthy, but produce disappointing harvests. Have you ever cut open a cauliflower and found it brown in the middle? Have your beets turned woody or corky? Do your apples develop strange pits? Those can all be signs that your soil is starving for one tiny nutrient. And the amazing part? It takes almost none. Just 1 level tablespoon of borax dissolved in 1 gallon of water can treat a surprisingly large garden area when applied properly. Only once a year. That's it. But listen carefully to this next part. More is not better. In fact, this may be the only garden amendment where an extra handful can create more problems than it solves. An old farmer once told me, boron is a whisper, not a shout. And he was right. Use only a tiny amount, and sometimes the difference in the next harvest can be incredible. Bigger tomatoes. Healthier broccoli. Stronger fruit set. Because sometimes the thing limiting your garden isn't fertilizer, it's one tiny missing ingredient hiding in the soil. But nutrient problems happen slowly. The next problem attacks much faster. Now let's talk about the pests that don't eat your garden. They eat your house. Termites. Carpenter ants. The insects that quietly destroy wood from the inside while everything still looks perfectly fine. This next trick is the one that saved my brother's old barn. And that's why I never forgot it. Mix borax into warm water until it stops dissolving. Then brush or spray the solution onto bare, unfinished wood. Fence posts. Porch beams. Barn sills. Even firewood before you bring it indoors. The wood slowly absorbs the borax deep into its fibers. And here's the fascinating part. A termite doesn't die because the wood becomes poisonous. It dies because it can no longer digest the very thing it came to eat. The insect keeps chewing. Keeps feeding. But little by little, its digestive system stops working. Eventually, the colony loses one of its greatest advantages. Its ability to turn wood into food. A few cents worth of powder, protecting thousands of dollars worth of lumber. That's why old farmers treated fence posts and barn wood long before expensive wood preservatives became common. But termites are patient. The next pest isn't. It arrives suddenly, and can turn a beautiful lawn into a patchwork of dead brown spots almost overnight. The last trick protects your wood for years. But now let's talk about the problem that's already growing in your garden. And if your tomatoes are already chest high, if your squash is already sprawling, if your beds are already mulched and you're thinking, this video would have helped me 2 months ago. Don't leave. Because this next one is for you. You can do it this weekend. Maybe even tomorrow morning. Have you seen that strange white dust spreading across your squash leaves? Or your cucumbers? Or your zinnias? At first it looks harmless. Then suddenly, half the plant looks like someone sprinkled flour all over it. That's powdery mildew. And once it gets going, it can spread shockingly fast. Here's the old remedy. 1 teaspoon of borax. 1 tablespoon of cooking oil. 1 gallon of water. Shake it hard. Then spray the tops and bottoms of the affected leaves early in the morning before the sun gets strong. The borax changes the surface conditions of the leaf. The fungus hates it. And the oil helps the mixture cling exactly where it's needed. Many gardeners watch the spread slow dramatically after treating infected plants, because sometimes you don't need to pull out the plant. You just need to change the conditions the fungus depends on. But mildew spreads above the ground. The next problem is hiding below it. 3 applications. For days apart. That's all it took for me to save squash vines I was already planning to pull out and throw away. Sometimes you don't need to start over. You just need to spray. But fungus isn't the only thing creeping into your property. Let's talk about something much simpler. Weeds. Not in your garden beds. I'm talking about the cracks in the sidewalk. The driveway. The spaces between patio stones. Those places where absolutely nothing should be growing. Here's the important warning. Keep borax far away from the plants you want to keep, because it doesn't know the difference between a weed and your favorite flower. But in cracks where you want bare ground, it's a different story. Dissolve 1 1/4 cups of borax into 1 gallon of warm water. Then pour it directly into the cracks on a dry, sunny day. The crabgrass. The dandelions. The creeping weeds that come back every year. Many gardeners find they disappear and stay gone for the season. My father did this every June around the old milk house. No expensive weed killer. No special equipment. Just a watering can and something that had already been sitting in the cupboard. But weeds don't move. The next visitor does. And if you've ever opened a shed and heard something scurry into the corner, you already know what's coming. Number 9. Mice. Now let me tell you something important right away. Borax is not some instant mouse killer. And that's exactly why this next trick surprises most people. Now let's talk about mice. And no, I'm not going to tell you borax is some magical instant mouse poison. It isn't. What surprised me is something different. Mice hate places that feel uncomfortable. A heavy line of fine powder around a doorway, feed bin, or dark corner can become one more reason they decide to move somewhere else. Sprinkle a generous band across the threshold of the shed. Around the feed barrels. Behind the chicken feeder. The powder clings to their feet. They clean themselves. And many simply decide your shed isn't worth the trouble. The grain stays where it belongs. And honestly, the mice become somebody else's problem. Now we're getting very close to the one I promised you at the beginning. But first, one more old-fashioned use. Mold and mildew. The smell of an old cellar. The dark spots under a porch. That north-facing wall that never seems to dry out. Most people buy expensive bottles that are mostly water. My grandmother had another solution. 1 cup of borax. 1 quart of hot water. A stiff brush. Scrub the surface well, and then do something that surprises almost everyone. Leave it there. Don't rinse it off. The remaining borax keeps working long after you're finished scrubbing. I can still remember my grandmother cleaning the cellar steps every spring. She lived to be 87 years old. And her cellar never smelled like a cellar. But everything we've talked about so far, ants, mildew, weeds, mice, was only leading to the final trick. The one almost nobody talks about anymore. It never smelled damp. It smelled like clean stone. And now, the last one. The secret I promised you at the beginning. Almost nobody talks about this anymore. I only learned it because one autumn afternoon my wife's father, a beekeeper and orchard man from Ohio, sat me down on an old hickory stump and said, "If you own apple trees, remember this. Because the worst enemy of a backyard orchard isn't drought. It isn't deer. It's the worm inside a beautiful apple. The one that leaves that ugly brown tunnel all the way to the core. The coddling moth. Every year people spend money on traps, sticky bands, special sprays, and repeat treatments all season long. But here's the old orchard trick. I want you to remember this one. Even write it down. Before spring arrives, before the buds begin to open, mix borax with warm water until it becomes a thick paste, almost like heavy cream. Then take a paintbrush and paint a wide band around the trunk of the tree. Start about a foot above the ground and continue upward for several feet. Simple. Cheap. And almost forgotten. Because sometimes the oldest tricks survive for one reason. They work. That's it. One painted band. One tree. Pennies. Because the coddling moth spends the winter hiding in the bark of the tree. When spring arrives and the larvae begin crawling toward the new growth, they have to cross that barrier. And many never make it. I have used this method on my own apple trees for more than a decade. Last autumn I cut open 40 apples. 38 were perfect all the way to the core. Only 2 had a worm. That's the kind of harvest every backyard orchard dreams about. And it came from a box that costs less than a cup of coffee. Think about that. A simple white powder that can help with ants, mildew, weeds, wood pests, soil deficiencies, and even cleaner apples. Not a miracle. Not magic. Just old knowledge that most people forgot. Maybe the greatest garden secrets aren't new at all. Maybe they've been sitting on a shelf in the laundry aisle this entire time. So before you spend another $100 on bottles and sprays this season, look around your house. You might already own the answer. The truth is, we didn't lose this knowledge by accident. Little by little, people stopped teaching the old ways because there wasn't much money in simple answers. But we're bringing some of it back. One garden. One season. One old trick at a time. And there is a certain kind of freedom in knowing that sometimes the solution to a problem isn't another expensive bottle, it's something already sitting in your cupboard. If you're the kind of gardener who likes simple, practical solutions, if you'd rather spend $2 than 40, then you're in the right place. Now I want to hear from you. What state are you gardening in this year? And what's your biggest problem right now? Tomato hornworms. Powdery mildew. Fire ants. Something eating your apples. Tell me below. I read every comment. And more than once, your questions have become the next video. Because the best garden ideas don't come from advertisements. They come from gardeners helping gardeners. If you enjoy old-fashioned, practical knowledge that saves money and actually works, then subscribe. Because next time I'm going to show you what one ordinary cup of wood ash can do to one of the most stubborn weeds in the American lawn. There is one weed in particular that simply cannot tolerate it. And I think the answer may surprise you. But before you go, pull your chair back up to the kitchen table for a minute. Because many of you have written asking the same question: what exactly is borax? Where does it come from? And if it's been around for generations, why don't we hear much about it anymore? That's a fair question. The little white powder in that blue and green box isn't some modern invention. It isn't a secret chemical cooked up in a factory. Borax is a natural mineral. It's mined from ancient lake beds that dried up thousands of years ago. In other words, it came out of the ground. Long before it ever came out of a cardboard box. And that's one reason generations of gardeners, farmers, and homeowners kept a box of it on the shelf. Not because it was magic. But because it was simple. Inexpensive. And surprisingly useful. And sometimes the most valuable things in the house are the ones we've stopped noticing. The little white powder in that box has a much longer story than most people realize. America's largest borax deposit sits in the California desert, in a town actually called Boron. And more than a century ago, before highways and trucks, this mineral was hauled across the Mojave by the famous 20 mule teams. They were real. 20 mules. 2 enormous wagons. A giant water tank. More than 160 miles of open desert. And somehow those teams hauled tons of borax without losing a single wagon. That's the supply chain behind the little box sitting on a grocery shelf today. But history is only interesting if it helps us grow better gardens. Here's what matters. Boron, the element inside borax, is a micronutrient. Plants don't need much of it. But they do need some. Tomatoes that bloom and drop their flowers. Pepper plants that refuse to set fruit. Apple trees covered in blossoms that later produce disappointing harvests. Sometimes the problem isn't fertilizer. It's a tiny shortage of one trace element. And because it only takes a tiny amount to fix, the old-timers measured carefully. A spoon. Not a scoop. Not a handful. A spoon. Now I want to be perfectly honest with you. Borax is not magic. And more is absolutely not better. Too much can damage plants and create problems that last for years. That's why the old gardeners treated it with respect. A little can help. A lot can hurt. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson hidden in this entire video. The difference between a remedy and a mistake is often only a spoonful for the ants. A tablespoon for the fruit tree. A carefully measured amount for a foundation treatment. Not guesses. Not handfuls. Not about this much. Exact measurements. Because the old gardeners understood something we've mostly forgotten. With borax, precision matters. One of my favorite stories comes from an old recipe card written in 1926 by a woman named Esther Yoder. Her granddaughter still farms in Ohio today. On that faded card, Esther wrote the instructions carefully. And then she did something interesting. She underlined one word 3 different times. Level. Level teaspoon. Not heaping. Not rounded. Not just a little extra. Level. Because she understood that the difference between helping a plant and harming it could be surprisingly small. That old card has survived nearly 100 years. And maybe the most important thing written on it wasn't the recipe itself. It was the reminder to respect the measurement. Because old knowledge wasn't careless. It was careful. Measured. And precise. The old-timers understood something we've slowly forgotten. The difference between a remedy and a problem is often just the amount you use. Medicine and poison are sometimes separated by nothing more than a spoonful. And they respected that fact the way you respect a hot stove. Now, I want to answer a question I've been seeing in the comments. It's a fair one. If borax is so useful, why does the box have so many warning labels now? The answer isn't exciting, but it's honest. Over the years, regulators around the world began adding warnings for situations involving very high, long-term industrial exposure to borax. We're talking about miners and factory workers handling large amounts of dust day after day for many years. That's very different from using a carefully measured teaspoon in the garden or around the house. And because companies sell products in many countries, it's often easier to print one label that satisfies every market. So the box may look more alarming than it did decades ago. But the powder itself hasn't changed. It's the same mineral generations of families kept on a shelf and used carefully and sparingly. And maybe that's the real lesson. Old knowledge wasn't about using more. It was about using enough. Read the label. Keep it away from children and pets, just as you would any household product. Measure carefully. Use only what you need. And that's really the whole secret. But before I let you get back to your evening, I want to leave you with one last story. An old farmer once told me something I've never forgotten. He said the difference between a garden that feeds a family and one that only frustrates it comes down to a handful of decisions every year. When to plant. When to mulch. When to water deeply instead of a little every day. When to let the weather do its work. When to pull a plant that isn't going to make it. And when to reach for the cupboard instead of the catalog. I think about that often. Because the last decision costs almost nothing. Yet it can save money, solve problems, and sometimes rescue an entire season. That old farmer raised children, grandchildren, and fed more neighbors than he could probably count. Every August, people would show up at his back door carrying empty baskets and hopeful smiles. And somehow there was always enough to share. That's really what this channel is about. Not miracle products. Not expensive tricks. Just practical knowledge that helps ordinary people grow a little more food, save a little more money, and pass a little wisdom to the next generation. Not a product. Not a trick. A way of thinking. A habit of looking at your own pantry before reaching for your wallet. A habit of asking, do I already have something that can help? Before driving to the garden center. The catalog can wait. The advertisements can wait. The expensive bottles can wait. Because sometimes the answer has been sitting quietly under the kitchen sink all along. Patient as Sunday. Waiting for someone to remember what it can do. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. The most useful things in life are often the ones we stopped noticing. The old tools. The old knowledge. The simple answers. They're still here. We just have to remember where we put them.